Hello.
Hey, Jim.
How are you doing?
Good, good. Look at us finally able to do this, huh?
It's so funny because I've got this friend that I sometimes go canoeing with, but we don't go canoeing often because he's like, let's make plans to go canoeing. And I'll be like, I'm driving out right now to go canoeing. What are you doing? And he's like, that's not enough time to make plans. And I was like, but that works good for me. So this panned out.
Yeah, totally. I'm with you there. I almost find that planning things too far in advance, there's too much time for nuance to get in the way, and those spontaneous plans usually end up happening more often than the, month long, well planned
Yeah.
out plans.
I call nuance my children, right?
Yeah.
There's more time for them to have some kind of like need to get somewhere or be somewhere, which almost happened today, but then didn't happen today.
I actually can say I know how that is now that I'm a forest school substitute teacher. And
Hmm.
especially this time of year when there are so many people getting sick and having to stay home with kids and all that sort of stuff.
Right, I bet. How nice to be a substitute teacher in a forest school. That
Yeah,
seems like a pretty good
it
way to sub.
it definitely is. It definitely is. It's something that's new to me for sure, but I love spending time outside. And then, yeah, I had learned that there were 4 different forest schools in my area. So I
Mhm.
quickly got in touch with them and began substitute teaching. And yeah, a lot of good things have come as a result. Minus,
Uh,
of course, we've had to postpone this call
right.
a couple of times now. But
Well, I mean, since what last late winter, it's only been since then I think that conversations first started.
exactly,
Mhm.
exactly right. And I'm glad we were finally able to do this. This is awesome. So thank you for carving out the time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, vice versa. What part of Canada are you in?
We're in southwestern Ontario. Do you know
Oh,
Canada
okay.
very well?
I know Canada. I know some places. I've been some places in Canada, and those places I kind of sort of know, and other places I don't know at all.
That's fair. I feel like that about the States. I know a couple of them, and I wouldn't even say very well, but
Mhm.
so much of it I don't know. Like I could never tell you all of the states or anything of the sort, but
So Southwest Ontario, does that put you on like the peninsula, like surrounded by the lakes part of Ontario, or is it southwest but up higher? So like not as far south but farther west?
no, you actually got it. We're right on the peninsula. So between, I mean, it's all Lake Huron, but
Mhm.
we're exactly there. So right at the, we're just about 40 minutes south of the tip of the peninsula.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, yeah. So you knew exactly where. Have you been to Ontario before?
Yeah, we used to, well, when my, let's see, wife, then girlfriend and I first started dating, you didn't need passports to get across the border. And so we would sometimes like drive up along the Lake Huron coast and, like go out to Harson's Island or go out to Walpole Island or go across the Blue Water Bridge, and just stroll around there. And then when we would go to the northeast before passport times, we would just cut through Ontario because it didn't make sense to go around all the lakes and everything.
Oh,
And
exactly.
then it got more complicated.
It's wild to think about a time before passports were needed to cross. Was
I
there
know.
still like border security where they asked you a bunch of questions but didn't require any documents kind of thing, or
Mhm.
more or less?
The last time that we went through there, which was still before passports, it had been a long time since we cut through Canada, and we were driving out to Massachusetts since we cut through Ontario. And as we were coming back, it was coming back into the States. Like, I was getting the grill for being like long-haired guy and like basically just for being long-haired guy crossing a border. And they're like, oh, what's in the back seat? I'm like, my baby is in the back seat. He's sleeping. He's about a year old. And they're like, oh, you can just go on. And I was like, no way. Like I would have like spent my young years with just a car seat in the back covered with blankets.
Right, yeah.
It was
And
a
you had known that was the secret to getting into the
it
country.
was a get out of hassle free thing, right?
It's funny that you say that. We suffer from, I mean, not so much myself being a long haired female, but my fiance, he's a long haired male as well. And I feel like every time I don't know, we even cross paths with a police officer, any sort of like law enforcement, they always look at us as if we're up to no good. I don't know. The long
Mhm.
hair seems to be a bit of a stereotype, I think.
Yeah, it's funny because I was out on the West Coast And I just made some kind of passing reference to that. And they're like, oh, that's not really a thing. I'm like, yeah, it's not a thing out here. It's a thing where I'm from. Like I've had actually also my wife, she got pulled over when she was driving because the cop saw me in the car with her and pulled her over and like asked for my ID. And they're like, what are you smoking? I'm gonna search your car. I'm like, I'm not smoking anything. You can search the car. Like, I don't care. You can call dogs and everything. And then he seemed intimidated. And then he looked down and saw how pregnant Stephanie was at the time. And then he's like, get your windshield fixed. It's cracked. And I'm like, you're such a...
That
But
is
yeah,
totally
it's like,
not why you pulled me over.
it's definitely a thing.
Well, and there's, I guess, the other side to that coin where, like, being herbalists, we carry herbs on us at all times, which, to the common eye probably look like paraphernalia. And I mean, it's legal now here in Canada, but I don't imagine the same goes for Michigan. Like, as far
We
as
have legal cannabis too. Yeah. And legal psychedelics in Detroit and Washtenaw County around Ann Arbor. And then hopefully they're planning a referendum for the next election. So that would be pretty wonderful. I'm not completely confident that would go through, but it would just be nice for things that are alive and exist in nature not to be illegal.
Absolutely, the way they probably always should have been.
Yeah, right.
I know. I definitely hear you there. There's been so much talk here since now cannabis is legal here about obviously psilocybin and all the other things that kind of string along with that. So I'm curious to see how things unfold now that we've kind of crossed the first barrier, which in our case, for us here is cannabis, and just curious to see where that ends up taking us.
Cool. Do you know a bunch of the Toronto herbalists? Or are they like a whole other world?
No, not at all. I know a couple of them. Are there any that you'd know that you want to throw some names out?
Well, so I knew John Redden, but he just passed away like a year ago, and he was a spectacular herbalist, and not quite in the Toronto area, but Eston McLeod has come and taught at the Great Lakes Herb Fair. She's an Anishinaabe herbalist. I'm not sure what part of Ontario she's in, but she's in Ontario. And then I think that Abra Arneson, she moved from around Alberta to somewhere sort of around Toronto, but I never really quite figured out where. I mean, I read it, and I read that it was near Toronto, but I don't have the geography to sort of figure out closer to you, farther to you. And then also not quite Toronto, but Christine Dennis is in Port Burwell on Lake Erie, and she's super cool. Although I haven't seen her in a really long time.
So I know two of those names. I will definitely have to look into the other two, but Abra, she lives just outside of Ottawa, as far as I last knew. Okay. I doubt she would have moved in the last few months, but so she's there. And then Christine Dennis, I only met recently because I was actually working on, I was helping run the volunteers for a lady slipper event that we did, which was a women's herbal gathering. So Abra was one of the main people to kind of run it, and then Christine was the keynote for it. So I got to meet both of them in person at that. So that was really, really awesome, and both wonderful herbalists. I could spend hours and hours with both of them and just pick their brain for days.
I met Abra at the Alberta Herbalist Gathering, and I remember, like, I didn't get to hang out with her a whole lot because she was an organizer. She was busy and everything, but she moderated this panel, and I was like, oh, I love the idea of a panel, but every time I'm on a panel, it doesn't play out as good as I feel like it could. And I looked, and I was like, they have all of the teachers. There's like 14 of us there. There's no way this is going to work. This is going to be chaos. But Abra was just like, she'd ask a question, and then she'd be like, okay, you're done talking, let them talk. Like, or like, wait, you already got your chance to talk. Stop talking, let them finish. And I was just like, wow, it was actually one of the best panels I was ever on, because she was so good at like keeping it moving and like not letting people bicker or cut each other off or anything like that. It was pretty astounding.
Yeah, I believe that. Knowing what I know of her, I can very much see that that's a very good role for her to be in, where it's, okay, moving on to the next and weeding through the chaos in a very elegant way. So yeah, I could definitely.
Yeah, she was very good at it. The other person who ran that gathering was Robert Rogers, and I don't think that he would have been. I like Robert a lot. I don't think he would have been as good at just being like, just stop talking. You can't talk anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think I'd be very good at that either. I'm always listening to the very last word, wanting to know what everybody has to say, and
Mhm.
probably too polite to ever cut anybody off usually.
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah. That's cool. So who are your main teachers? Like I know you do a lot of self-study.
I
After
did a lot
listening
of
to
self-study. Um, so I got into this and like sometime in the mid 90s, I'd have to go back and look on my website to find out what year it was. And like it's not like the internet didn't exist, but a lot of people weren't using it. I mean, I certainly didn't have a computer. And I just got books and went out into the woods and picked stuff and made stuff. And I fortunately had Stephanie who would try stuff that I made and a few friends, we would make stuff and they would drink it. So I got to really just start like learning about things, being like, here, drink this, here, try this, here, I made this, and doing that with myself. And so that was like the real impetus, is that right when I got interested, it wasn't like, I'm going to learn about this and then maybe I think I'll try some of it. It was like, oh, there's a willow tree in our yard. I can scrape some of the bark off there and pour boiling water on it. I can do that. And so we did that. I did that for a bunch of years and then read a bunch of books. And then I guess pre-Facebook, it still kind of exists, but it's a hollow shell of what it once was. They were like old email listservs. They were kind of like Yahoo groups. And Henriette Kress had one. And that became like my link to the larger herb world. And because at the time I didn't have kids and I had a job that had the internet, and my boss was super cool, and he's like, oh, if you don't have work to do, I don't like, do whatever you want. I don't care. Like, just don't let it interfere with your work. And so I was able to like post a lot and write a lot and ask questions and respond to questions. And that was like it was the most interactive way that I had to like sort of like communicate with other herbalists who knew stuff that I didn't. I got to know I guess the first herb thing I went to was a weekend class with Matthew Wood and Rosemary Gladstar. I met both of them and hung out with them and maintained communication to this day. They're both friends of mine. And then Matt was really nice. He was like, oh, you're into this. Here's, a draft copy of the book that I think he still hasn't really released it. And then, Rosemary offered me a bunch of opportunities to teach places. And then I got to know Paul Bergner. I got to know Howie Brownstein. So it was like I just met the right people and everyone was nice to me in that they were like, oh, he seems smart and interested and sincere, and like if I can do something that will help him out, giving him information, answering questions, I'll do that. And then I learned a bunch of stuff,
That's
and then it
amazing.
was also a lot of learn by doing, a lot of like I don't have the same spot in the same room. I just do it in different places around the house now, but I would just be confused about something. I just sit and wonder about it, for minutes, hours, days, weeks, months. And then hopefully eventually, and oftentimes I'd be like, oh, wait, if I think about it like this, I can kind of understand it. And that ended up being like a significant part of the way that I teach, because the feedback that I generally get from people is like, oh, I really like how you figured out how to use examples and stories and analogies and silly props and stuff to explain concepts. And I'm like, well, I had to do that for myself. Like, that's how I learn. And I figure that if it helps me learn, it'll help other people learn. And it's more fun too,
Absolutely. Absolutely. That definitely comes across. And I remember I listened to your, I guess, super generous and epic 3-hour long podcast that you did for Herb Rally, the Q&A. And I remember you mentioning that and it resonated with me as well. You were kind of alluding to the fact that herbalism, it's like the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And it's like this ever evolving thing. And I definitely resonate with that because that's why I'm so attracted to it too. But I think a lot of people get stuck in the learning phase and not the experimenting phase. And it's fun that you kind of did it the other way around. And I feel like we probably hold on to so much more in our minds when we can actually have tangible experiences to draw back on. And
Yeah, totally. I think that it's like, I'll tell students sometimes, I'm like, if you were taking, like, no one would take cooking classes or go to cooking school and be like, I'm going to go to cooking school for 2 years. And then at the end of it, I can try actually cooking. Like, you have to you have to cook to learn to cook. And
Mhm.
if you're learning about herbs, you have to like use stuff to learn how to use stuff. And I think that people, they feel intimidated by that. But I mean, realistically, most of the stuff that we use, as long as, you're not making stuff out of aconite or, like, and I know that there are people who are really enamored by all the strong or, low dose herbs. And they want to use those because they feel, I don't know, maybe like stronger things or stronger rather than like they're more forceful, but they're not necessarily stronger than something gentle, And if we're working with like the most common herbs we use in Western herbalism, it's unlikely you're gonna hurt someone or damage somebody. You might upset someone's stomach, or you might aggravate their dry cough by drying it out too much, or do something like that, but nothing that's, substantially dangerous.
Definitely. And from all those negative outcomes, you learn probably even more out of,
Right.
uncovering something that maybe you weren't achieving necessarily to begin with.
Oh
Or
yeah,
hope.
especially if you're self-experimenting. You're like,
Yeah.
well, I'm not gonna do that again. Now
It's
that
so
happens if you experiment on your partner too, right? If you kind of sort of not really, but just right on the border poison your partner, you'd be like, I maybe shouldn't do that again.
yeah, maybe not this time. I give great kudos to Brandon for still putting up with me and all the things that I make him try.
Uh,
Although I think he has a wicked palate for bitters now, which I think he's pretty proud of, and certain other things. But yeah, it's fun to have a partner to try things on, and it's to try the same thing on both people, because I find it's so different, our reactions to things, obviously based on our different constitutions and all that kind of stuff too.
I really lucked out because other than my wife being, well, girlfriend, partner, wife, being like super awesome, she also has like the completely sort of like opposite constitution that I have. So it's like I'm just never gonna get a damp sinus infection, Like it's just kind of not, it's never happened before, so it's probably not gonna happen. And I have gotten damp upper respiratory infections, but they've been really pretty transient. But like some of the stuff that have been like the best herbs for her, they're not good for me. And I also kind of going back to the cooking, like I feel learning about herbalism that I need to I I don't give anybody anything that I haven't used myself. Even if it's not sort of like energetically the most appropriate thing for me, like I want to know why it's not. And so I've tried all of this stuff. There might be like a few supplements, like nutritional supplements that I haven't used, but plant-wise, I don't think I've ever given anyone something that I haven't used myself. And I feel like that would also be weird. It would be like going back to the cooking analogy, it'd be like, oh, I made you this food. Like I've never tasted it, but I made it for you to taste, which that would be unusual. That would be a strange way to go about cooking.
Definitely. And it would almost be similar to, if you have a friend and then there's this person you never met and you're like, hey, you should go hang out with this person. I think you'd like them, even though you've never met this person in your life or something
Mhm.
or other, because there's no experience to draw on.
Yeah, sometimes I've been somewhere and I'll be teaching and it could be an herb walker, it could be in a class and someone will ask me a question about a plant. And I always try to be pretty clear, like I know certain things about that plant, but I haven't used it, right? So like I
Yeah,
know that plant is demulcent and I have a sense of it, right? But I haven't used it. So like bear that in mind and like that I'm not speaking from experience here. And I think that I wish that was more of a norm. And maybe, well, I guess as much speaking, but also like writing, because I still do a lot of like open community classes, which means that I have the course that I run that goes from, April through October, and there's an in-person version and there's an online person version. And people come, and generally the people that are taking that class, like they're interested in more like learning herbalism. But I also have lots of day classes that might be like anywhere from like 2.5 to 6 or 7 hours long that anyone can just come to because they're kind of vaguely interested. And those people will often say like, what are good books to get? And I think that like there's so many different ways to answer that question, depending on like what aspect of herbalism somebody is into, right? But one of the things that's like a requirement for me is like, if you're getting a book about herbs, it should be written by someone who uses the herbs that they're writing about, because I've seen so many situations where people will, I'll just not mention any by name. So many situations where people will be like, oh, I got this book and it has so much information. And I've seen a lot of books. And, you know, when I hear about a book that's like really popular, I try to find a copy and look at it. And not uncommonly, I'll be like, I don't think they've ever tasted this plant. You know, I don't think they've used this plant. I know where they got that sentence and that sentence and that sentence and that sentence. Like I see how they piecemealed it together. And it's not like we don't want to reference other people's work, but sometimes, you know, there's knowing about stuff versus actually knowing stuff. And, you know, if you were going to get your brakes fixed, you probably want to get your brakes fixed by somebody who fixed brakes before and not just read about fixing brakes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's so true. And with that in mind too, do you remember the point where you went from studying herbalism, and I know we study it forever because it's just, again, one of those things that you can always continue to unpack and try new herbs and all this sort of stuff that we're saying, to actually feeling comfortable being able to say I am a herbalist? Or was it, I don't know, I know personally it's almost easier to hear other people say that I am as opposed to it coming from my own mouth. But I don't know if you ever experienced that.
So, yeah, that happened like early for me, because that same weekend that I went and met Matthew Wood and Rosemary Gladstar and Paul Strauss down at the Botanical Sanctuary in Rutland, Ohio, the United Plant Savers Botanical Sanctuary. That was like sort of, there's an herbalist, I should say, the first like herbalist that I met was an herbalist in Detroit. His name's Gary Wantaja. He's got a shop called Nature's Products, and you know, he's got like, I don't know, like 300 jars of dried bulk herbs in his shop. And you go in there and he fills up little bags for you. And he's got like a beam scale. It's pretty awesome. And so he's like the first herbalist that I met who was really plant wise. And the first like herbal community, anything I went to was this gathering with Rosemary and Matthew Wood, and then also Paul Strauss, because he's sort of like the steward of the sanctuary down there. And two funny things happened when I got up. Is the first thing is I was really unknown then. And as I walked up, you know, there were two young women signing people in, doing registration for like the weekend. And one of them's like, you must be Jim McDonald. And I was just like, oh, wow, that's weird. And then they both cracked up and they're like, you're the only dude, you know, because there were no other guys signed up. And I was like, oh, haha. And then one of them said like, oh, are you an herbalist? And this is maybe, I mean, only like somewhere between 3 and 4 years into it. And I was like, yeah, I mean, yeah, I must be, right? Because I dig stuff up, I make things, I give them to myself and to other people. And I like the idea, and I feel kind of strongly about this, and I know other people feel differently, but I like the idea of like, if you're a person who loves plants and uses plants to help yourself and the people around you, whether it's just your immediate family or your small friend group or your extended community group, or you're a clinical herbalist or whatever, like those are all herbalists. They're just different kinds of herbalists, right? And sometimes I feel like there are a lot of people who think like, oh, you know, you're not an herbalist until you're like a clinical herbalist, or, you know, like you've had a certain amount of learning and, you know, then you can be called an herbalist. And we wouldn't say that about like someone being a cook. And we wouldn't say that about someone being an artist, or like you make your living doing it, right? It's like you can be a cook, but not be a professional cook. You can be an artist, but not be a professional artist. You can be a photographer, but not be a professional photographer. And all we need to do is like have herbalist be the inclusive term. And then if we need to, we can add like an adjective to it and say clinical herbalist or family herbalist or community herbalist or beginner herbalist, or in some cases, like not very good herbalist, because there are those out there. And, like, but I really want more people to call themselves herbalists. Because what else would you, like, if you're not an herbalist, then what else are you? If you're the person that's like making stuff with plants and they're like a focal point in your life, and what word would you use? Like, why wouldn't you use herbalist? And maybe the only reason is, some people want to have a limited definition of herbalist so that it can be theirs and people like them.
Yeah, I could see that.
I get that. I understand why they want to do that, but I don't want to do that. I want everyone to be like, oh yes, I'm an herbalist, and then realize that herbalist isn't an endpoint. Like, herbalist is more like an acknowledgement. But that said, like, what you were saying about other people saying, that you're an herbalist and that feeling more comfortable, I agree with that. And there's a spectacular guy out in Eugene, Oregon, named Howie Brownstein. And Howie, he posted online occasionally. I don't know that it's on his website, but every now and again, he'll post something he wrote up. It's maybe a couple paragraphs long or a few paragraphs long. And it's about like his students asking them, when am I an herbalist? And in a really well-written piece, he basically says, like, you're an herbalist when your community decides that you were their herbalist, right? And it doesn't necessarily correlate to how much education or training, formal or informal, that you've had. It's just like when people are coming to you and they're like, you're my herbalist, then yes, you're an herbalist.
I love that. I love that for a few different reasons, because number one, it makes it more accessible to people when we think about it that way, and it reminds me back to the time when everyone living was an herbalist in some way. Like, we had to rely on plants for food, medicine, materials, everything we needed, right? And I think it speaks to the connection that we had so deeply way back when. It's not so much that way now, but it makes me think about that too. And I think anybody who works with plants, why not consider themselves an herbalist? But I like what you were saying about when your community comes to you, and that's kind of when that's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the big catapults, I guess, learning catapults, is I got sort of like nagged into teaching classes. And that would have been like probably late 90s, if I had to guess. And I'm not entirely sure, but like, I would go places and, things would happen to people. They'd have a splinter, they'd get bit by a mosquito bite, they would step on a hot coal around a fire, and I would wander off and come back and be like, put that on it. And I remember one time someone said, do you notice it when he comes back for like a burn around a fire? Like, it's not the same thing every time, it's like different things. And the place that I was spending a lot of time at, had classes, and like, you should teach a class on this. I'm like, I don't know how to teach classes. I don't know. And I got asked enough time, and I'm like, oh, okay. And so like the first class that I ever did was like a 7-hour herb walk.
Wow.
Yeah, it was kind of ridiculous. I think it was like $20. It was a 7-hour herb walk, and there was like 30 pages of handouts. And I think back then, of the first year of classes, like, you also got lunch somehow, and I gave everyone like a bottle of tincture. It was I can't do that anymore. That's not a part of the thing anymore.
Yeah, that's a big.
I probably am still struggling with pricing and trying to figure out like where like the right ground is for all of that. But when I did that, it's just really because here in Michigan at the time, and things are actually considerably different now, but in Michigan at the time, in the part of Michigan that I was at, there weren't really the people doing it. And so having people come to classes and ask questions and then show up at the next class and then maybe like say that what I suggested or the answer to my question either worked or didn't work or did this unusual thing or that, that's really what got me the experience. Having more than just like a small circle of friends and my wife to try stuff out on, right? I got a broader age range and a broader range of, different issues that people had. I made some good recommendations and some terrible recommendations. Like I still feel slightly bad for someone who had psoriasis. No, I think it was someone had their gallbladder out, and I suggested yellow dock decoctions, and now that just sounds like, oh, that was mean. And
You'll
even
never
then
know.
I had drank yellow dock decoctions, but I don't think I had ever drank them like day after day after day after day, because there's a big difference between drinking something like once and being like, oh wow, that has a really interesting flavor, and drinking something like most days every week, week after week after week, when you get to the sort of point where you're like, no,
I can't drink anymore.
right, yeah.
So was it after that experience that led you down the educational path of herbalism? Is that kind of where it
Yeah,
all started?
I taught the class, and then because I did a spring walk, I was like, well, I guess I'm going to do like a summer walk and a fall walk. And then I was like, oh, now it's cold and snowy. I guess I can do a class on like immune system herbs. And then in the winter, I guess in January, I did a class on like herbs and stress and nervous system stuff. And then for the longest time, March was sort of like I would think of some class that I could do, and it might be respiratory stuff or digestive stuff. So it started off where I was teaching like every 2 months at this one location, Upland Hills Ecological Awareness Center, where I taught for decades. And then, students who came there would say like, oh, would you come here and teach? And would you come there and teach? And, that happened. And there were times when the turnout was great, and there were times when the turnout was like depressing. Maybe not depressing, but like that made me think like, oh, I would feel like really happy, like, oh, things are going really good. Maybe I should keep doing this. And then I'd have like really lousy turnout for a couple classes and go like, oh, maybe this isn't going to pan out. But mostly people said like, if they say like, how did you get to where you are? It's just largely because I just didn't stop doing anything. I just
Mhm.
kept teaching classes, and I kept learning, and I kept asking questions, and I keep wondering about stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes
Mm.
sense. And it makes me wonder, does your life still very much look like that? I know a lot of people often wonder, what does a day in the life of an herbalist actually look like? And I know that looks so different for so many people, but do you still teach as often? Is that still your main focus?
Um, I still do a ton of teaching.
Mhm.
The last several years have been weird in terms of like the way that the teaching has worked. So there was a time where I was doing more teaching than I've done in at least the last couple of years, and that's been related to the pandemic. And I also a few years ago had this kind of crazy distressing situation where I almost died out in Scotland. That's like a long story.
A heart
Uh,
thing or something, wasn't it?
yeah, there's all of you out there, between you have four chambers in your hearts, and the top ones are the atriums and the lower ones are your ventricles, and in between them there's something called the septum, and the septum is not supposed to have a hole in it, and if it does, when your heart squeezes blood to go out into your lungs, rather than going into your lungs and getting oxygen and then going back to your heart and then taking that oxygen to the rest of your body, the blood that's doesn't have any oxygen, it goes to the other side of your heart, it gets pumped out to the other side of your body, and it doesn't work good like that. It's like, yeah, that's a problem. So that happened in 2018, and that really put most of 2018 into like a not much happening mode. And then 2019, I did my herb course, but I didn't schedule a whole lot of other stuff because everything was really stressful. And then 2020, the pandemic came around and everything. So 2017, I was out teaching classes all the time, everywhere, usually like a trip out of state, almost every month, and then gigs around the bioregion, weekly, a few times a week in a lot of cases. And I did that. And I love that, but also it's maybe not super sustainable, you know. There were definitely times where I would make my calendar and I would look at it and be like, I can do this. And then when it became actual time to be like, wait a minute, I'm driving like from here to there and then back here and then up to there and then down here and over there. And I'm like, that's who came up with this schedule? This is terrible. But it was me. Um, one of the things that the pandemic has sort of like opened up for more people is like online courses being sort of like seen as legitimate. You know, for a while people were like, oh, you can't do online stuff, and I very distinctly remember some herbalists being like, oh, you can't really do online consults, that's not like a real consult. And now nobody thinks that, and so I do have more online classes that take some of the me having to drive everywhere or fly everywhere, you know, kind of like off the table. And I don't have to do as much of that just to like pay my bills and feed my kids and have some splurge money. I do
Yes.
like splurge money, but
Now
yeah,
you have
so
more time to
I
enjoy.
get to do maybe there's like the online classes both allow me to reach people who don't live close enough,
Mhm.
or maybe they do live close enough because I've had people come from far away, but they don't have the means to travel out because of whatever's going on in their life or what their situation is, to be able to take classes. And it takes some of the pressure off of me to not have to always physically be somewhere else to make a living.
Absolutely.
Um, but I like, I mean, like I got into the teaching, and the thing that I like about the thing that I like so much about teaching is I think it can be fun, right? And that I learn all the time when I teach. But I also like, I really like that anytime I get to teach, even if the material that I'm teaching is like a class that I've written and it has a structure and it sometimes you can't tell, but it has a, we're going to cover this and then go to this and then go to this and then go to this and go to this, and it's all going to tie together. Um, the questions that people ask, and you know, like the tangents we get to go on, and I can be kind of tangential, just a smidge. It makes everything new so that it's not like just a recitation, like here's my class, I'm going to recite it all to you. And I don't want to dismiss that some people don't like to have this sort of like question free for all during their teaching, and they want like questions at the end. But for me, it's like the questions and the discussion and the, oh yeah, what about, or like, oh, well, I have this experience that I want to share. Um, it's what keeps everything fresh for me. So I don't feel
Mhm.
like, you know, play tape, rewind, play tape, rewind, play tape, rewind, and just do the same class over and it doesn't change as much as it could. And I, you know, I don't actually have, I just cleaned up my, I, I kind of cleaned up the desk that's right here, but on the notes that I sometimes look at in the margins, I'll just write down stuff. Like if someone mentioned something, I was like, oh, that's brilliant, that should be in here, but I didn't think about that. I try to like write down a note, and then the next year when I'm going through the handouts and tweaking them or updating them, I'll try to like see if I can fit that in there or include that, and then the class keeps growing and changing. So
I
yeah, the
love
teaching
that.
it's pretty awesome. You know, teaching is learning, is learning is teaching, is teaching is learning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we, like you had said, right? We learn so much more by teaching, I find, as opposed to just learning it for ourselves when we can actually share it with other people. I mean, it touches a different part of us that we remember so much more vividly.
Yeah,
And it's cool that the course is ever evolving based on feedback and different conversations and the tangents that I think if anybody's listening to this, they probably love your tangents already. That's definitely a huge part of why I love listening to you talk, because it's always fun to see where you end up. But and where do you teach right now? Like, is this at home? Or are you at in a building outside of your home?
so right now this is what used to be the classroom, because I used to have, for the course that I do, I have a course that runs from, like the long-term course runs from April through October. It's called Lindera. There's an online version, there's an in-person version. It's almost but not entirely half outside anyway, and there used to be like, they were the classroom days and the field walk days. So our materia medica and talking about the plants, I was like, why would I do that in the classroom. Like, why would I not go out and we can do an herb walk, and the herb walk is also the materia medica, and we can see all the plants and be where they're at and see their habitats, and it's also more fun, and we get exercise.
For sure.
And that way also, like, if we do the classroom day on Saturday and then we do the walk on Sunday, it really works out. You know, people are in the class, they're taking in more information and concepts. And then to me, the thought of like, and we do have 2 back-to-back classroom days, twice in the course, but the thought of doing that 2 days in a row all the time when we could get people out and moving doesn't make sense. And also, again, I want to be out and moving. But this used to be the classroom. And then when the pandemic happened, I was like, oh, okay, you know, I could fit like 25 people in here, but I can't fit 25 people in here when there's some kind of like respiratory bug, people are close together, there's not good airflow. And so we started renting an outdoor pavilion, I guess the last 20, 21, 22, the last 3 years, we did all of the classroom days under like a roof and posts at a state park. It looks like next year we have a building that has a nice outside space to use, but I'm hoping if everything works out, we can actually have the classroom days in a building again. So if it's cold or rainy, we're not sitting down in cold and rain. And now what was once the classroom is sort of like where we record the online classes, and it is where I have all my jars and bottles, and we are in the midst of converting it into more of an office. Whereas right now we have an office, but the office is like not a dedicated office space. It's like office space plus storage space, overflow space. So it's like office plus lots of extra boxes that aren't involved in our actual work.
Well, it's good that you have a landing zone for all the other activities to happen in.
Yeah.
And so with that, do you also still see clients one-on-one, or do you focus mostly on education now?
So I've always done both, and I've frequently had a backlog for like one-on-one consults. And the backlog has been interesting because it's not like most things it's not like a super linear backlog. And I know that this will disappoint some people that are a part of the backlog, but I've got a list of people that want to see me that is larger than the amount of time and space I have available to see everyone. And I try to tell everyone that up front, right? So that I'm not leaving them hanging. But I'll ask people to give me like sort of like a Cliff Notes version of what's going on with them. And sometimes someone will have something where I'll be like, oh, but I kind of like, I have the resources, or what, you know, like I could make this happen and work very easily. And so they might get like a bump in ahead of the line. And other times what happens is I might be talking to someone and they cancel, and I will just like go through the list and call people and do kind of like what we did, is like, hey, today, what are you doing today? Are you available today?
Right now?
And when you do that, all of a sudden, some people might jump ahead in line because they're available today. They have that ability to spontaneously be like, oh yes, I can talk to you today. And then sometimes there's just like emergencies, you know, where someone has something that is like, oh, this is not like wait open-endedly until someone can see you. And I will jump in and see if I can at least give them what they need to handle a very time-sensitive or emergency situation. But to me, like, in order for me not to feel sort of like overburdened with all of the structural aspects of making things work, I do teaching, I do wildcrafting, I do medicine making, I work with people, I do a bunch of different things, and that way I don't get sick of any one of them, you know. That has been sort of like a strategy that I've purposely had out there. And sometimes I do feel like, oh, there's too many things that I'm doing. I don't have time for all of the different things I'm doing. But it's okay. I try to do my best just to be really clear to people about like what I'm able to do, what I'm not able to do, and hope. And I know for sure I might do this, but like my inability to get back to everyone as quickly as maybe they would like, isn't upsetting to them, or at least I've prefaced it with like, I'm not saying that I can do that. There absolutely was a time when, because I wanted to be able to help everyone, I think I overpromised, what I was able to do more, and then I couldn't keep up, and then that didn't feel good, and probably people felt left hanging, and that's on me. And now I just try to be clear, with what I feel able to do.
Definitely. I think that's very transparent. I think I've even read that somewhere, even just with emails, I try to get back to all of them, but I just can't, and just keep bugging me because I don't not want to talk to you. I just don't always have the time.
There was once upon a time, and it was a really long time. It's been a long time, but there was once upon a time where I would go through all my emails, and I'd be like, I'm going to respond to all of these. I'll go back like 2 years to respond to all the emails. But yeah, I can't do that anymore.
No.
Too many emails plus two other. I mean, like I think it has to do with just being responsible to also like my family and myself and the people that I live with. Of like I'd like to. I honestly, I would love to be able to do that. If I could just not have to worry about the practicalities of making a living, I would be doing free stuff for people all the time.
Oh yeah. I know it's hard to find a balance between that, wanting to make things super accessible and do all the things that meet people where they're at, but also finding a way to keep life sustainable, on a financial aspect is huge too.
It's super challenging. There are people who are very good at that, and there are different ways to do it that work for different people. But I don't find it to be one of my like super skill sets. I have other super skill sets, right? But being a business person who can just say like, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it like that, and not think like, oh, but what if someone can't afford it? That's
Always thinking about the what ifs. Well, and I find it's hard too, and maybe you'll resonate with this as well, but I find herbalism is one of those things that you can't separate your personal and professional life. They're so interwoven. So it's kind of hard there's no switch you can turn off at the end of the day and, the life outside of work, because it just is so incorporated.
Yeah, I do try really hard to be like, oh, I got this email at 11:49. I don't need to answer it right now, or like thinking about how to prioritize stuff, right? Because a lot of us do, like, we have this giving nature, and we are like, we're just so excited about plants. And it's like, ooh, I'm excited about plants, and this other person is excited about plants. Like, we could be excited about plants together. But you can burn up all of your time and a lot of your energy doing that. And so there is just sort of like the realistic, responsibility of saying like, oh, okay, I can't, like I can't answer all of the emails, and I can't respond to everyone, and I can't do all of the gigs that are proposed to me, and that's been something where someone will say like, oh, would you be willing to come here and do this for us? And my initial answer to a lot of those is like, oh, I would love to, And then I think about it, I'm like, well, wait, I have to be practical and think like, if I go there and do that, how much will I make for doing that? And then would I be able to make the same or more or a lot more doing something else or doing something less, And yeah, that just comes along with the business aspect of it. And I think that, a lot of people don't necessarily talk about like how much time you spend working on websites or doing like all the other stuff, um, I'm fairly active online and have been for a long time, but I'm not someone who's constantly posting like pictures of me doing things, you know?
Mhm.
And sometimes I think that that messaging of like, oh, look, there's a person and every day they're out in a meadow, you know, gathering calendula or like processing something. And you don't often see, you know, someone going through their receipts or, you know, trying to like emptying all of the bottles that, you know, like that they need to wash out, or going through like their amber bottle order and being like, oh, I have to individually wash all these bottles because, and I know that not everyone does this, but bottles, when you buy bulk bottles, they don't come to you clean. You should really wash them out. You know, and we don't see that, and just not even the herb stuff, but just like the keeping up with life stuff and all of the other stuff. We don't see that, and it can be something that people will be like, oh, I look and I saw all these other people and they're able to like be doing all of this stuff that is like the pure herbalism, the picking and the making and the pouring of the bottles and everything. But it doesn't necessarily convey the actuality of it and all the practicalities and things you need to think about, you know, and that's a part of it. And just trying to find like where we all want our balance points to be as much as we're able to, you know, so that we don't burn out of that. I was a long time ago, I was like, oh, I'm gonna have a small, you know, tincture company, and there's a bunch of reasons why I didn't have that be like the direction that I went, but one of them is like labeling lots of tincture bottles, like a lot of tincture bottles, and putting all the labels on them and getting them to be straight and pouring them accurately, because I think a lot of us like we fill up our tincture bottle to like here, but really if it has an ounce on it, it's only filled up to here. So we like overfill everything.
Mhm.
You know, if you're doing a tincture company, you can't do that all the time. You know,
Yeah.
you start off with a quart of tincture and you fill up like 28 bottles. You're like, whoa, that's like 4 bottles shy of what I had because I overfilled them all. Um, so yeah, just thinking about all the different things and, you know, like what we need to do, what we want to do, the areas we want to go into it. I like really, like for me, focusing on the teaching has been like, that's been, I do the other stuff, but the main focus has been on the teaching.
Yeah. It reminds me of, it makes me think of like cooking and baking. You know, I lean towards the cooking side of herbalism as opposed to baking with the precision and accuracy and all that sort of stuff, which I think a lot of us probably lean towards that other side too. But are there herbs that you find that you use on a regular basis that kind of help ease the day, depending on like I get?
Well, lots of different herbs that I use on a regular basis. I mean, I do like my coffee
Me too. I'm an avid.
with some chocolate in it. That's cocoa powder in there.
Oh, yeah.
I like that. I really do like kava kava. I'm a huge fan of milky oats. Um, and you know, a lot of like there's stuff that I take on a regular basis. There's also sort of like just loving and interacting and thinking about plants all the time. And I'm
Mhm.
fortunate enough that I live in a place where it's not the middle of the wilderness, you know, but it's a more rural area. And so my yard is surrounded by and sometimes being overtaken by plants and a lot of weedy plants and everything like that. And so there's like that daily interaction of, you know, when I go out, when I look out the windows in pretty much all directions, I get to see a lot of the plants that I use, and that keeps me thinking about them and in relationship with them.
That's wonderful. I remember in one of your talks you mentioned herbal chews and that they were so underrated.
Yes,
Are you still an avid fan or, and I
I
guess in the winter too, it changes the landscape a bit. Maybe you can't chew as often, but
um I think it's just I went through you know, there's a surprisingly not as many as you think there would be, but there's a few books on you know, different herbal preparations. And none of them meant, I mean, that I can think of mention like take bark, root, leaf, chew on it and stick it in your cheek and kind of suck on the juices. No, like a respiratory infection just went through the house, and I had the kids chewing on stuff, because I feel like you chew on something, it infuses your saliva, and then you just keep swallowing it. It keeps getting absorbed through your bloodstream. There's a lot of different things you can chew. There's some leaves. Obviously, plantain is really great as a chew. There are sustainability considerations with OSHA. OSHA is great with a chew. A plant that you can cultivate more readily, although you can get cultivated OSHA, a plant you can cultivate more readily, that probably is the most overlapping, is lovage. And you could use that root as a chew. I love, and actually I kind of fell in love with using chews, using sweet flag root or calamus root, and think the world of that. And the chews can be for, addressing throat infections, for helping with your voice if you're a teacher or a singer. I like to use the joke of, like, if you're in a AC/DC cover band, you don't want to burn out, you chew on some violet leaves or some sassafras leaves or something demulcent. Or you can use chews to sort of like clarify your senses, and sweet flag calamus root does all of that, right? It's sort of like clarifying to your senses, has antimicrobial action that helps to sort of like sustain the voice. And so that's been pretty wonderful. And I just love that plant. That's a plant that I initially learned about early on when I was learning about plants. And it's probably the first plant I mostly learned about through using it and chewing on it, as opposed to like reading stuff about it and basing what I knew about the plant from that. Because I think that at the time, everything that I read about it just said like it's a digestive, bitter, and aromatic carminative, and it was mostly like a digestive thing. And then I was chewing on it and reading the Silmarillion and thinking, the Silmarillion is awesome. I'm like, wow, something in my perception seems a little bit different. And then trying to think about it, what it was, and realizing that calamus can sort of like broaden your perception, or like it broadens maybe your perceptual depth of field. A lot of people will say like it increases focus, and it does do that, but rather like increasing focus like on a narrow way like that, like I'm looking at that thing, I can focus on that one thing. It sort of like expands your focus, like, oh, everything is in focus, or lots of things are in focus. And I can take in more information and consider more information. And I would go out in the woods and chew on calamus and go for walks and just think about life or whatever was going on, any kind of personal issues or struggles. And then just kind of like see what insight struck. And I don't know that I ever read that anywhere, like I learned about that by doing it. And that taught me a few different things. One of the things that I learned from doing that was that we do learn about things directly from using them. And some of that is coming from the plant. But also, like, if I am feeling a certain way, and I can think and perceive how I'm feeling, and then I make tea, or I take a tincture, or I chew on a root, and wait a little bit, and I can be like, okay, I just introduced something new in. What's changed? Like, what changed? Like, did my breathing change? Did my sensation of warmth change? Do I feel more activated, or sort of like aware, or do I feel more relaxed, or do I feel both at the same time? And having that sort of like seeing where we're at, consuming something and seeing what it changes in us, can really be like this way that we're learning about plants through an awareness of their interaction with us, right? It's not just because I feel like a lot of times people think like, oh, if I learn from plants, it's because the plant came to me and said like, I am Solomon's seal, and I want to whisper this thing in your ear, and da 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 da. And sure, that can happen, but other times it's like, it's this interaction, and it is our thinking mind doing some logical reasoning, and that's just as valid as any kind of like intuitive or inspired, like, oh, I get it. And using, say, like your intellect to think about how you were feeling before you use the herb and how you're feeling after the herb, and being open to like an intuitive or an inspired perception of plants, and also sort of like using your imagination or your creative thinking, right? Not so much like, I'm just going to make up something and then tell everyone the herb does this. People do this, but I mean, like open-endedly and creatively thinking about plants and thinking like, oh, I wonder what would happen if I did this or thought about it like this or tried that. And then you don't just imagine up a use or virtue of a plant, you like come up with an idea and then you apply your intellect and you see whether it actually works. And your imagination and your intellect and your intuition all like they balance each other out and complement each other. And we can learn things a lot more fully than we can if we are only intellectually thinking about herbs or only intuitively thinking about herbs. And I think that that's important, you know, because sometimes you'll meet people and they're like, oh, you know, it came through my intuition, so it has to be right. And I'm like, it doesn't seem like that's the case, though. Right? My intuition has been wrong before.
Many times. Me
Yes.
too. Well, and I think it's one thing to read something, but it's a whole other to experience. And I think there's probably some room for placebo too when you read something and then
Mhm.
experience the plant. If you've read something about it before actually trying it yourself, you kind of have expectations that certain things
Yeah.
might happen as opposed to holding space for what naturally occurs.
There's a practice that I learned from Christopher Headley. And Christopher Headley was this amazing Tom Bombadil of an herbalist who lived in London. He passed away a few years ago on the autumnal equinox because he's Christopher. And he came, I had known him through like online circles and email and through correspondence, but he came to the International Herb Symposium one of the years that I was there. And so I got to meet him and hang out with him. And he did a class, and it's called the blind tea tasting. And what it entails is one person, the person, you know, facilitating the class, makes a tea of an herb and doesn't tell anyone what it is. Nobody knows what it is. And initially everyone gets their tea and they just smell it. They don't taste it. They just smell it. And you might, depending on the herb, if I was doing this exercise, we might smell it for like 15 minutes. We might smell it for like a half hour. And people can say like, oh, I feel like my sinuses opened up, or like, oh, I feel more relaxed, or oh, I feel more aware. The goal of this particular exercise is not to be like, I think this plant is this, or to say, I think this plant has a lot of volatile oils. It's only to sort of like say things about what your body is feeling, not to interpret it, right?
Mhm.
And then after some time goes by, everyone can take a sip and then see like what changes. And then after a little bit more time goes by, I let people sort of like sip at will and then keep collecting this information. And when I've done that, it's been really amazing because I've often come up with what would essentially be a better monograph on the plant than I've ever seen written down anywhere. Because when people know something about a plant, if they know what the plant is, they will automatically think to what that plant is supposed to do and be looking for that, and not necessarily be looking at the things that the plant does that aren't thought of, you know. So for example, if we were tasting Damiana, everyone would be like, ooh, I feel excited. If they knew it was Damiana, but they probably wouldn't be focusing on the fact that Damiana is an amazing digestive herb or an amazing respiratory, lower respiratory and upper respiratory herb, right? Because that's not what we think about with Damiana. And when the plant's unknown and we're just really feeling how our body is responding and reacting to it, it gets our, you know, our interpretive head out of the way.
Mhm.
And at the same time, it's still kind of intellectual, right?
Mhm.
But what you're doing is you're just collecting the information and not having to solve it right away. And I would say that if there's one thing that I notice, not just in herbalism, but in the world in general, that I think is creates problems, is that people feel like I want to learn things and get the solution all at one time. Like if I learn something, I want to learn, I don't want to just learn that something happens. I want to learn the hows and the whys and have all of the questions answered right away so that I know it. And first of all, like that doesn't work all the time. You know, there's still a whole bunch of things we just don't know. It's not because someone's not telling you, it's because we still don't know, you know, what the answers are. But also, you know, things that you take more time and to process and wonder about, you often learn in a more deep and full way, even if that learning isn't attached to a solution of like, oh, I learned this and now I know this. You know, I learned about this herb and now I know that it does this, this, and this. You can be like, oh, I mean, the way that I think about plants a lot is, you know, wondering. I like the whole, everything about the word wonder I like about. I wonder about plants and I notice things in them. And so rather than saying like, for example, oh, this plant is aromatic, right? Aromatic plants often have volatile oils. Volatile oils often act as expectorant, or volatile oils act as expectorants, and they act as diuretics, and they act as carminative, and they act as circulatory stimulants, and they act as relaxants, and they act like this and this. So therefore, this plant has these volatile oils in them, and it does these different things. And the way that I would be more inclined to think about it is like, oh, I can perceive through interacting with this plant that it's aromatic. And I know that aromatic plants are often have their smell because of volatile oils. And volatile oils can do this or this or this or this or this. How is this plant manifesting that? How does it fall in line with what aromatic plants do? And where might it not? Like, where might it be different? Where might it do something unexpected or differently than that? And then my understanding of a plant is based on my relation to it at the time that I'm using it, which continues to grow and expand over time, just like it does with people. You know, and to me, that feels like a really just sincere way to interact with plants and, you know, help people with them and understand their virtues, is to be like, oh, this is a relationship that we're starting, and it unfolds, and that plants aren't things to like figure out and know anymore. People are things to like figure out and know, because we can, and often do, I think, have not super helpful responses to knowing things. So like, if I know something and then I come across information that contradicts what I know, I might not feel confident anymore, or I might feel defensive rather than just being like, oh, that's interesting. You know, if we have this sort of like open-ended relationship where we haven't come to like a finality of like, okay, now I know this, I'm done, right? I've succeeded, I know this, I'm done with this, I can move on to the next thing. We can become defensive, we can become unconfident, we can, you know, not continue to learn more about something. And why do that when we can just remain open-ended about things and have an attitude of inquiry and discovery that doesn't have to have an endpoint of knowing?
Absolutely. Being in that place of wonder, as you said, where it's too easy to pigeonhole herbs too, in the ways that we kind of use them mostly, maybe, but there's so much else to the plants and at the different stages of the plant's life and the different person we are at every time we take these different herbs too. So there's so much more to it on both ends. Absolutely.
Yeah, different people, different situations. And you know, so in the teaching that I do, one of the things, I'm talking to people about the different courses that I do right now. One of the things is to say that even though there's a lot of information that I cover in the class isn't about like, I'm going to totally simplify this. Like there's 1,000 units of information. And if you remember 900 of them, you did a really good job, you know? That would be weird. That would be like conventional education, which I think is problematic, right? What I think is like there is a certain way, like my goal in teaching isn't to teach people to memorize the information so that they know the information and therefore they know about the organ system, or they know about the herb, or they know about this or that, but that there's a way of thinking that I think helps us to have a better understanding of herbs and have a better understanding of health and wellness. And that's what I want to convey. And the information we can backfill later on. We can take our time in learning it. It doesn't need to be like a race or a rush to be like, oh, I got into herbs. I want to know all the things now so I know it, and therefore I'm good enough to use herbs. It's like, oh, I understand, some of this stuff. And maybe at a certain point, and I still find this, like, I'll be learning from someone who knows different things than me and be like, wow, I don't know that at all. I have no idea what's going on here. But then when I look at how they're using herbs rather than how they're explaining how they use herbs, I'm like, oh, I would do that too. I just wouldn't ever talk about like something being serotonergic or dopaminergic or GABAergic, like I don't think in those terms ever, except to explain to people that I don't really know them or understand them. But when I meet people who do think in those terms and they use herbs that way, and then I look at the way that I use herbs, I'm like, oh, I guess I do understand that. That's just not the language that I used for it, in the same way that I guess pretty much all traditional herbalism, was built around story and analogies and, ideas, qualitative ideas, rather than being sort of like quantified with information to justify it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, that's so cool. Well, I know we're kind of pushing time here. We've been chatting for just over an hour. So I wanted to say that's a good place to wrap up, because I think it leaves people in that place of wonder and curiosity, and for the love of storytelling, just hearing about how other people use herbs, and maybe that encourages other people to use herbs too. I'm curious to know one final question, which is very unrelated to what we had been talking about, but I was asked this yesterday and I thought, oh, if I could talk to Jim, I want to know what he says. And so the question was, if you could take 3 herbs to a desert island, what 3 herbs would you take? And I'm just curious to hear what 3 herbs you would pick.
Oh, okay, I can do that. This is actually so easy.
Okay.
Plantain.
I had a feeling that would be one.
Yeah. Kava. Echinacea. Calamus. Oh, hold on, I'm starting to cheat, aren't I? Yeah, probably some spice bush.
Right.
So what I would do is I would break the rules and take more stuff.
Right? Say you're only taking 3, but take 5.
Right, totally. I've done that when people ask that question, I have to type out that. I'll just like write 1, 2, 2, 2, and 3. Whether we can do that. Yeah, I would say break the rules, right? When the rules seem unjust, you might be, it might be a good thing to be civilly disobedient and break those.
Yeah, for a just cause.
It's such a hard thing to think about. Maybe if I'm on a desert island, I'm like so relaxed because I don't have any responsibilities. And then I don't need the kava as much.
That you might not need that.
But I just like kava. And I would be sad if I didn't have my friends around, I'd be sad if like
your allies, right?
Yeah. Like, oh, there are some plants that like, they're really important herbs to me, but I don't use them at all. I just walk by them and see them and they make me happy. Like you probably have these, I don't know what the Latin name for them is at all, but they're called pinks or Deptford pinks. And right around the same time St. John's wort is blooming, there is a grass and it has a flower that's like small, like the flower is just that small, and it's like the brightest pink fuchsia color. And I'm like, I love pinks. Like they make me so happy to walk through a meadow that have pinks growing in them. But I've never done like I've never made tea with them. I've never I think I tasted one before. I don't really quite remember what it was. It just makes me happy to be there. And so if it wasn't around, I would just be kind of
sad about it.
Yeah, I would miss them.
I feel that way about goldenrod. If I didn't have, like, we've let our lawn go, it's kind of in its shape of rewilding after a couple of years, and we have so much goldenrod that comes in now. And I always think, imagine, you know, especially late fall without having goldenrods. They just make me smile every time I see them. So they might not be one of my plants to take with me to the desert island, but if I didn't see them, I'd be really upset about it.
You know, I'm thinking, and I'm going to spoil this now because some people are going to hear this, and the next time I do it, they'll be like, "Oh, wait, he said he was going to do this," but like, what if someone were to ask that question? I'd be like, "Oh, I would bring like bindweed and like Japanese knotweed and Solatius orbiculatus, like these really invasive plants, which like take over the island." People are like, "No, don't bring them here." Who would bring bindweed?
Right? Just to throw a curveball into it.
It would, yeah.
Of course.
Completely change the answer, like the way people think about that question. Yeah, we
Yeah.
had bindweed. I did a lot of plant rescue. Do a lot of plant rescue where if I see some area that's being developed, I'll like basically trespass, go in there, and I'll look and see if there's something that is less common or more rare, and I want to dig it up and move it to some other place. And in the act of rescuing some bone set, which is still growing wonderfully in my yard and abundantly and more every year, I inadvertently brought bindweed into my yard, and then the bindweed has been doing its bindweediness like for decades now. And one day I was in my bedroom and the bindweed is growing right on the other side of the walls, on the outside. It's supposed to be growing on the outside, but I looked at the carpet, and about a few inches of wall coming up through my carpet was bindweed. And I was like, no way. Yeah. So
Wow.
yeah.
That is an invasive plant, I suppose. It's funny, I've always had a hard time with the word invasive because it kind of villainizes plants. And I think that there's so much to invasive plants that I think we should admire, you know, like their tenacity for wanting to be so resilient, which I think is just incredible. So it's funny, I always have a hard time with that. And we have lots of knotweed here for sure. And there's several other plants that we have that are very invasive. And I'm just trying to change the way I think about that, in that just to remind myself of their resiliency and all the other good things about invasive plants.
So I have this thought that invasivity is like a behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't make something good or bad, it's just a behavior. And some plants are non-native, but I don't really consider them to be invasive. Some plants are native, and yet they have invasive characteristics, you know, in that they crowd out other stuff and sort of like want to take over. And then there's like invasive species that I just look at and I'm like, well, yeah, that plant's pretty destructive. Like, I mean, like it really, it's not a bad plant, but it is going to destroy the habitat. And I think that here in Michigan, oh gosh, this is going on like 20 years ago, when we first moved to our place and we did a bunch of work in the yard. Spotted knapweed was sort of like coming up and taking over, and that's this invasive species that is supposed to secrete some compound from its roots that inhibits the growth of other plants and forms like dense monocultures, and you can't ever get rid of it. And I spent a bunch of time digging out of my my so-called lawn, time and energy, and I didn't even get into the field where it was taking off. And you know, 5-6 years later, the only place it was still growing was in the lawn, because the field, it went and it took over the field, but then other plants came and took over the field. And there was like a period of succession where the invasive phase of that particular plant, at least where I live, right? Because that's a whole nother thing to think about, is that plants aren't like, an invasive species isn't an invasive species everywhere, and it will behave differently in different places. the places that I didn't touch that other plants started growing in, it's just gone. There's none of it there now. Not a single plant, you know, so 20 years later, not one. There's still like a smidge in our yard, but even most of that's gone. And that is something that happens. There is a plant called ox-eye daisy. You probably have it where you're at, white daisy flowered. I'm going to use the old Latin name because it's so much cooler, Chrysanthemum leucanthemum. And that plant was once called summer snow, and they thought that it was going to crowd out and destroy all the native goldenrods because it was so aggressive. And then it went through its invasive phase and then naturalized, right? So it became went from being an invasive species to a naturalized species, and it wasn't behaving invasively anymore. And that same process will probably eventually happen with things like buckthorn, with the Celastris orbiculatus, the invasive bittersweet vine, except rather than taking like several years, it might take like several decades, right? It might be that the buckthorn creates such dense shade that it allows certain shade-loving tree nuts and seeds to germinate and then grow up through them more slowly and then shade them out where they can't exist anymore. But that process will take a whole lot longer. And in that process, we will lose other plants, you know. And it's not about any particular plant being bad or having any kind of like judgment needing to be applied to it. It's just doing what it is. It's plants they're native to the habitats that they thrive in, more so than like coordinates on a map, you know.
Definitely.
So
Yeah.
if I think about like an urban area, you know, that is all lawns and concrete and not many trees, that let's say black cohosh used to be native in, well, the black cohosh isn't native in that environment anymore, you know. If something is like acres and acres and acres of farmer's field, that's not the kind of soil or conditions that black cohosh is native to. Now there are all kinds of new things that are native to that, and that changes. So we don't want to vilify these things, but I do think that one of the things that I've seen around people who have lots of concerns about invasive species is that it's not just about removing the invasive species, it's about sort of like restoring habitats. And if you remove invasive species without restoring habitats, it seems like it's like not really going to be a winning battle. If we even want the battle terminology, right?
Yeah, definitely. Makes me think of even, you know, a barren piece of land that maybe not a lot can grow on. Maybe an invasive comes in and is able to flourish, and then it changes the soil so that
it changes the soil. Yeah.
You know, just completely changes landscape. So I think there's so much good in them too. Yeah.
Yeah, but don't bring bittersweet to the island.
Yeah, don't bring it there. If it can grow through carpet, it can grow through anything.
Go through your house.
Landscape. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Okay, one last question, Jim, and then I will bid you adieu. That's so funny. I just had a question, and then, oh, what's your latest muse? That's what I was going to ask you. Is there anything that's kind of fascinating you lately?
There's a couple different directions I could take that. You might notice that there's not very many short answers with me.
I like that though.
So I am still perpetually open-endedly amazed by like common plants I've been using for a really long time. I'm super interested. There's a plant I use called stone root, Collinsonia canadensis, and canadensis. I always get those mixed up. And that plant is, if it's popular at all, it's popularly known as like, oh, that's the plant that's good for like hemorrhoids, right? And it is a exceptional vascular tonic and vascular troporestorative that is probably also a cardiovascular troporestorative, working not just the blood vessels, but the heart too. But I just feel like it just does so much more than that. It's one of those plants that when I use it in a formula, I see changes in a person, and I'm like, is that from the stone root? Is the stone root working across like many different systems in ways that I don't understand yet? And so there are new plants that I don't know so much that I'm super interested in learning about, like burning bush, Unanimous alatus. I don't have a ton of experience with that, and I'm really interested in learning about that. But then there's just a lot of plants that I use that I just want to keep learning more and more and more and more about, instead of like enriching my understanding of them, right?
Yeah, in all of their diversity.
Yeah. Just even you know, when we were talking about the tasting test, and that how when you know a plant, you often think about the stuff you know about the plant, and you keep reinforcing those things.
Mhm.
Um, and how often are we also doing the other part of that, which is the plant does stuff that we don't know about, and so we don't pay attention to it, and we miss the opportunity of like adding an understanding of that aspect of the plant into the other stuff that we do understand about it, and using the plant more fully and more dynamically. And especially when we can do that with plants that grow commonly around us, and especially like the weedy plants, you know, and be like, oh, wow, you know, like as an example, like mullein is not just a lung herb for coughs, it's also like a nerve pain herb, and it is also a back pain herb, and a spinal strengthening herb, and a lymphatic herb.
Mhm.
And then when we use mullein, we can use it more appropriately because we can factor in all those other uses.
Mhm. It reminds me of a fun game I'll often play where you kind of take one herb and list as many different things that you could do with it as possible, which makes you really think
Mhm.
outside the normal box that you kind of pigeonhole these herbs into, kind of to similar to what you were saying in that respect. And now
Yeah.
one question for you, I have a burning bush that I actually have never worked with. Do you know anything that you'd want to share? Because I'm all ears. It's in a beautiful phase right
Okay,
now where it's
so here's
beautiful
this.
red.
This is like super open-ended. Hold on one second. I think. Oh, of course, it's not one of the jars that's in the front. I thought it was gonna be one of the jars in the front. I have a big jar of it. Burning bush is a plant that is used in Chinese medicine.
Mhm.
It's used for parasites and infections, severe infections. And I learned about it very vaguely and not concretely, as being an example of one of the really bitter herbs we might use for complicated infections like Lyme disease, and that there's been some research on using it for Lyme disease. And if we think about some of the other really strong antimicrobials that we might use for Lyme disease, and we thought about andrographis, or we thought about cryptolepis, they're really intensely bitter. Wormwood, really intensely bitter antimicrobials. And I was like, oh, so this is an invasive species where I live that has this particular usage for it. But the thing that really drew me in is I found something online that said that the Chinese name of it translated to, and this is gonna like enamor a bunch of people, but then I'm gonna undo it. The winged arrow that slays demons, or something like that, or kills demons. And I just thought, like, I want that on a label. I want that to be on a bottle label. Um, and so I went to a place where I knew it was growing early this spring, and I just clipped the ends of branches, you know, because it's the end of the branches that you use. And I dried it out, and it's not going to be something people are making decoctions of very happily, right? I made some tincture, and I've got that kind of like brewing, and I have someone that said that they would try it out, you know, who's like savvy on herbs, to give me some feedback. But moving more into my research, I contacted a friend of mine who lives in China, and is would he call himself a scholar of Chinese medicine? He's a studious person. He studies Chinese medicine and has been reading a lot of Chinese text in the original Chinese, and making notes about how what we often say in, let's say, North America about what Chinese medicine says isn't really quite actually what Chinese medicine says. Like in the
Mhm.
translation, some things have been altered or changed or not really translated correctly. And he said, well, actually, I can't really see how you get the winged arrow that kills demons or slays demons out of the Chinese name for it. And he sent me a picture of like the actual written out in Chinese. And he was like, this means this, and I can see maybe this, but not that. And I was like, well, damn, because I still really want to put that on the bottle label. And so one of my quandaries right now is, do I still put that on the bottle label and feign ignorance, or just say like, it's just another name for it that might not be entirely accurate, right?
But too cool not to share.
Or should I not do that? I don't know. I might just make my own different name for it that sounds something like that.
Maybe you can think long and hard about an experience that makes that feel true to you. So you could still use that.
I'm sure that with
there's a way.
enough effort, I can make it work for me.
Yeah, I was gonna say, enough pondering, I'm sure you'd get there.
I mean, if I hadn't asked him, I would be like completely in the clear, right?
Yeah, right? Yeah, not to pigeonhole, but to pigeonhole. How can I make this thing fit this herb?
Well, it does kind of tell us how sometimes we learn something and then we want it to be true, and we have the attachment to it, and we don't want to like let it go. And now I just have to decide, like, do I have to let it go, or is it just, it doesn't matter enough, and I can use the other name for it.
Yeah. Well, and no matter what, I feel like from here on out, anytime you hear burning bush, your mind's automatically gonna say out the name.
Oh, to the winged arrow.
That's always gonna probably be the way you refer to it as.
I can get the label and it'll say like the winged arrow that slays demons, and then in like a 2 font above it, I can just write the word not. Right. You just have to figure out how to work around this stuff.
Exactly. Hence, there's too much to think about to start a tincture business. How else? It makes so much sense now. Well, Jim, it's been awesome chatting with you. I appreciate all your time. I know you probably have a busy day, so I definitely appreciate you taking the time to sit down and chat with me. It's been a pleasure. I always love listening to what you have to say. So,
thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sure anyone listening to this will enjoy it just as much as I have. So I appreciate it. And yeah, is there anything you wanted to say before we kind of sign off?
Oh, I should do the business stuff we talked about. Websites, herbcraft.org. So herbcraft.org, and then herbcraft.podia, Podia.com. And that's where all of like the online classes are. The herbcraft.org has like pretty much all free stuff and the lists of the in-person classes, and the Podia site has all of the sort of like online distance learning stuff. We are working at sort of merging them into one thing, but right now they're still separate. And you can look for information on either the short classes that I do or the long course that I do. There's hundreds of pages written out on my website. If you go to YouTube and you look up the stuff that I've got there, there's hours upon hours upon hours upon hours upon hours of free stuff that you can look at there. So tons of stuff that you can look into and be a resource to help you keep learning and stay interested in plants.
Wonderful. And I will link to all that in the show notes as well, so people can find that very easily. But yeah, hopefully we can do this again. But thank you so much, Jim.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. So long.
Yeah. Have a good one. See you, Jim.
Yeah, you as well.